Welcome to this presentation, Geography, Geology and the Bible. In this presentation, I will be looking at some geographical features on the Earth's surface that have biblical significance. I will also be focusing on the second chapter of the book of Daniel concerning the dream by King Nebuchadnezzar of a statue which represents 4 world ruling kingdoms which precede the establishment of God's kingdom on earth at the coming of Messiah. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 28, we read, "There is a God in heaven who reveals secrets." I hope that by the end of this presentation you will see that there is a secret in the Earth's geography to be revealed. Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Daniel chapter 12, verse 9. So if you have an understanding of Daniel's prophecy, you can be pretty sure that you are at or near the time of the end. The time of this man, Herbert Armstrong. Armstrong's ministry began in the 1930s, and he not unreasonably thought that Hitler and the Third Reich were the end-time beast power, which turned out not to be true, but Armstrong had made the crucial connection between the fourth kingdom of Daniel and the end-time beast power described in the book of Revelation, which in effect amounted to a modern revival of the Roman Empire, and linked that to the push for European unification after World War II. So we see here, wounded by the sword and yet lived, Revelation 13:4. So there had to be this appearance that the Roman Empire had fallen and come back to life, which is exactly what's happened when we look at the revivals of the Holy Roman Empire. In this diagram, you can see the various revivals of the Holy Roman Empire from the medieval period right up to the modern era. Here we see the Axis powers practicing the Roman salute. So the influence of the Romans re-emerges on the modern stage. Mussolini declared the restoration of the Roman Empire during the days of the Italian Empire back in the 1930s. So Armstrong looked at the 10 kings described in the book of Revelation in the latter days and saw a 10-nation confederation of modern European states made up of 2 legs and 10 toes of the image described in the book of Daniel. And that scenario couldn't really have happened before the time of Herbert Armstrong, because in the eastern part of Europe there were never nation states as such. This was a part of the world that had been under the heel of empires such as the Russians, the Mongols, and the Ottomans. But in the modern era, 5 nations couldn't emerge from Eastern Europe to form a 10-nation confederation with nations of Western Europe because they were locked up behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc. Nevertheless, Armstrong audaciously predicted that that would happen. And by around 1990, contrary to all conventional wisdom, that's precisely what happened. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Empire collapsed, and now nations from Eastern Europe were free to form a confederation with nations in Western Europe if they chose to do so. So now you get the possibility of the picture that you get in Daniel's image of 2 legs and 5 toes on each leg, representing the eastern and western parts of Europe able to be fulfilled. And furthermore, 10 nations coming together that will be partly strong and partly weak, the famous feet of clay. Now here we're taking something of a digression. You can see from this graphic that we're talking about the subject of continental drift. And In Genesis chapter 10, we find that Eber had two sons. One he named Peleg, for the earth was divided. Now here we see the Bible revealing an important scientific truth before its time. Just as, for example, in the book of Job, we read about God stretches out the heavens, as in Einstein and Hubble's expanding universe. We also read that the world hangs in space, and it also talks about the circle of the earth. The world is round. In the case of continental drift, the Bible talks about the earth being divided, just as we now know happened through the agency of this man, Alfred Wegener, who propounded the idea that the continents had once been joined together and broken apart. He wasn't the first man to propose this idea. There had been people before him looking at the world, the map of the world, and seeing how South America and Africa fitted snugly together, and suspected that the land masses had once been joined. But Wegener was the man who gave some kind of plausible explanation for how this had happened. He examined the fossil record and found that fossils of particular animals existed at the boundaries of these divided land masses, which plainly showed that the land masses had at one time been joined. And according to the fossil index, this could be dated as something like 220 million years ago. However, when the Bible talks about the land masses breaking apart, we are only talking about a few thousand years. So I am arguing here that the dinosaurs did not live millions or hundreds of millions of years ago, but in fact only a few thousand years ago. And to think that this knowledge had been available for literally thousands of years in Scripture, and people just didn't understand the significance of the words in Genesis 10 until the time of Wegener. So Scripture anticipates modern scientific discovery. And now if we look at the word divided as it appears in the biblical reference, the word used in this passage is divided. It is the word Peleg, which actually is more like the word channeling, which is to say land masses parting in a way that lets water in. When we look at this word Peleg, it appears in the English language in the form of pelagic. For example, an archipelago is a string of islands in the sea. Pelagic means oceanic, as in pelagic sharks. So it wasn't just dividing as such, it was dividing in such a way as to let the water in. And what divided? The word the Bible uses when it talks about the earth being divided, eretz in Hebrew, or arth in other Semitic languages, which of course is very similar to our word earth. What was divided was the ground under our feet. Now, even Bible scholars don't believe this. They believe that the earth being divided had to do with the Tower of Babel event when the nations were divided. But I'm proposing that both things occurred. The nations were divided and the earth was divided. The ground under our feet, the earth under our feet, so as to let in water. And getting back to what I said previously, that the dinosaurs in fact were quite recent. I was always told that dinosaur fossils were petrified, mineralized bone, not actually bone. Now, paleontologists are digging up dinosaur bones with soft tissues inside the bones. And Darwinists and evolutionists are saying, isn't it amazing that these soft tissues could remain soft for 68 million years? Well, no, they are not 68 million years old. Soft tissues could not possibly remain soft tissues for that long. And now we have the case of the coelacanth. an ancient creature, a prehistoric creature that died out 70 million years ago and then was found only a few decades ago off the coast of South Africa. This creature did not die out, go extinct, and just reappear. It never went extinct. And we also have the Ica stones of Peru. Carvings that depict the interaction of men and dinosaurs. These stones have been dated by German universities as being very old. They only have to be old enough to predate the discovery of dinosaur fossils back in the 1800s, but they have been dated as being centuries old, produced by the same people who produced the Nazca lines in the deserts of Peru. The skeptics say that these carvings are just modern counterfeits. Well, some of them may be. This is a very impoverished part of Peru, and people have been known to counterfeit the stones and sell them to tourists and to museums, but there are thousands of these stones. They are obviously old. The Ica stones were described by the Spanish conquistadors back in the 16th century, so they definitely existed before the modern discovery of fossil remains back in the 1800s. Some of these stones may have been counterfeited, but there are thousands of these stones. There's just no way that they could all be just modern forgeries. Just by way of clarification, the Ica stones that I'm displaying here include representations of dinosaurs, but most of these stones don't do that, which I think is another reason to think they're genuine, because they do portray other aspects of life. So to me, that suggests they're not just some creationist plot. So here we see a Rand McNally atlas from 1972, which shows what I believe happened. That in fact, the Earth was smaller than it currently is and expanded, with the result that the land masses broke apart. Ideas of continental drift are based on this massive supercontinent called Pangaea. I've never quite got this, how Pangaea just kind of randomly floats on the Earth's surface and then broke apart, giving us our modern continents. The land masses join together on the Pacific side, not unlike the way they do on the Atlantic side. So there is no way there could have been just a landmass floating on the Earth's surface. Obviously, Pangaea was in fact the entire surface of the Earth in ancient times, albeit with shallow seas, and the Earth has expanded, giving us our continents and landforms. And a smaller Earth could explain the massive size of dinosaurs anciently, because the Earth's gravity would have been less. I have no geological explanation for how this might have occurred, but it appears obvious to me that this is the explanation for how the Earth broke apart and gave us our present land masses, which also explains where the waters went after the flood, draining into the basins. And here is a representation of this process occurring. And here is one of the examples of continental drift. The Italian peninsula breaking free from the north coast of Africa, which I believe is a heavenly sign, a sign in the Earth's geography. So let's return to our story of Daniel and the prophecy of chapter 2. And it's all about a dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. He's had this troubling dream, and the wise men of the kingdom can't explain the dream to him. And Daniel appears before the king and offers to explain the dream, and tells the king that he has had a vision of a statue with a head of gold, chest of bronze, belly and thighs of brass, and legs of iron. And here we see a very typical depiction of this statue as Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And bear in mind that the final kingdom is destroyed by and immediately precedes the establishment of God's kingdom. In the past, I've often wondered about these four kingdoms. They all seemed a little bit random to me, as indeed maybe they do to other people as well, when you consider other major nations and empires that have existed throughout history. And then one day it occurred to me that when you think about it, that if you look at how this succession of kingdoms ends with the coming of the Messiah, the Messianic kingdom, and the kingdom of God, that made me think, well, where did it start? Because it starts with Babylon conquering the kingdom of Judah, and the conquest of the kingdom of Judah is quite significant because prior to that, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, God's people Israel, was effectively God's kingdom on earth. So you get the Gentile powers conquering God's kingdom on earth, and then in turn being conquered by it. The four empires are quite significant, not just for that reason, but also because they represent the westward march of Western civilization coming out of Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers, Babylon and Persia, starting out in that part of the world and moving to Greece, then on to Rome, and in the future, Western Europe. I'm just displaying diagrams from the NIV Bible, a very authoritative study Bible that shows just how widely accepted this interpretation of Daniel's prophecy is. It has been suggested by some in recent times that the fourth kingdom might be the Islamic Empire, but the Islamic conquests were carried out mainly by swift cavalry assaults and not the kind of mechanised warfare you'd associate with the heavily armoured Romans. And of course, not to mention the clanking armies of the Third Reich. The interesting thing about the empires of Daniel's prophecy and how they're to be identified, which a lot of people may not be quite clear about, is that the first three kingdoms are identified within the prophecy itself. The first kingdom is Babylon. This is the setting of the whole story. Babylon, in Daniel's lifetime, was overthrown by the Medes, and the third kingdom, being that of Greece, the third empire is identified as Greek in the 8th chapter of Daniel. So now we come to the fourth kingdom, which Daniel portrays as the legs of a statue, which is almost universally accepted as the Roman Empire. Here we have a graphic depiction of the two legs planted firmly in Eastern and Western Europe, going back to what I was talking about before, that there has always been this division in Europe, be it the Eastern and Western Roman empires or the Cold War division. And like the two legs of the statue, Rome was famously divided into two, the eastern and western parts divided up in the time of the Emperor Diocletian, because it was the empire in its original form was so unwieldy, it had to be broken up in order to allow the empire to be governed properly. And historically, of course, which we will deal with in a little while, but of course there is this uncanny connection between the eastern and western parts of the Roman Empire and a major religious body underpinning the political and military power of this empire, be it the Western or the Eastern Empire, a major religious institution growing up under the aegis of these empires, and that is the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox churches in the East. Now, of course, Daniel lived before the Roman Empire, and he doesn't identify the fourth kingdom as Rome within the prophecy. But when we come to the book of Revelation, which is so founded upon the prophecies of Daniel, and it comes a bit more clearly into focus. The book of Revelation says that this final kingdom sits on 7 hills, the famous 7 hills of Rome. Now, of course, Istanbul also sits on 7 hills. And as a matter of fact, I believe that Jerusalem sits on 7 hills. But they're all significant cities in God's plan. In Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, back in the 70s, a very popular book of Bible prophecy, taking his cue pretty much from the Armstrongs. Hal Lindsey talks about the final beast power, talks about a 10-nation confederacy in Europe as the beast power of Revelation. And this becomes very popular with Protestant evangelicals and students of prophecy, ruled over, as he so famously put it, by a future Führer. Now, here are some other points to note when we think about the fourth kingdom is Rome. Is it Rome? Well, think about these things. Jesus was a subject of the Roman Empire during his ministry and at the height of its power. Jesus was crucified by the Roman Empire, and he will in turn return and destroy it in its revived form. Very significantly, the writer of the book of Revelation, John, wrote during the time of the Roman Empire and himself identified the fourth kingdom as Rome. And where was this empire located? In Italy. Cast your mind back to the Italian peninsula, breaking free from the coast of North Africa. It has the shape of a human leg, exactly as the Roman Empire is depicted in the prophecies. And we have this church associated with the Roman Empire, which runs parallel with it. A church in its administration and offices echoes the institutions and offices of the ancient Roman Empire. Now, it's interesting when you look at a historical map of Europe and you find that a major political military power is associated with an Orthodox Christian church. In the West, you have Germany, that's been associated with the Roman Catholic Church via the Holy Roman Empire. And in the East, you have Russia associated with the Greek Orthodox Church. And I mentioned before that Istanbul, which used to be called Constantinople, and like Rome, sits on 7 hills, was the capital of the essentially Greek Byzantine Empire, which was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Now, for those of us with this general prophetical understanding, we expect an alliance of Asiatic peoples will challenge the beast power in the latter days, spearheaded by Russia. And this sounds like a part of the beast power making war against another part of the beast power. Now, this sounds a bit jarring, but it is plausible. But nevertheless, there is this parallel you find between a political military power in both the East and the West having spiritual roots in Christian orthodoxy. Now, historically, the surprising thing is that Putin, the former KGB communist operative, it turns out that he's always had something of a spiritual, religious side to his character. And in his role as Russia's leader, he's promoted the Russian Orthodox Church. And this calls to mind the spiritual links between Russian Orthodoxy and the Greek Orthodox Church. And Putin has visited Greek Orthodox monasteries as a way of strengthening these spiritual ties. Now, there's an interesting historical sidelight here, that during the war, you had a ferociously anti-religious Joseph Stalin originally a choir boy, back in the days when he was growing up in Georgia, he hated, despised, and persecuted the Russian Orthodox Church before the war. But during the war, when Russia was in so much danger from the German invasion, he actually began promoting the church as one of the few unifying forces that could link the whole country together in the war effort. Putin may well be doing the same thing as a political measure, but I'm quite sure that he does have a spiritual orientation to his character. And I think that he does see a lot of value in the Russian Orthodox Church, providing a spiritual dimension to life in Russia post the collapse of the Soviet Union. He is on record as having said the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster to ever hit Russia, which makes it sound like he has fond sentiments towards the old Soviet Union, but I don't think that's true. The reason why he thinks the fall of the Soviet Union was such a catastrophe for the country was simply that it threw the country into a period of turmoil and a tremendous degree of disunity where there had previously been peace and unity within the country. And we read in Matthew 24 that he will come in great power and glory. This refers to the time when Jesus will return and destroy the Roman Empire and establish God's kingdom on earth. And this is depicted as a rock smashing the statue at its feet. And as we see here, Messiah defeats the kingdoms of this world at the Battle of Jerusalem, which people misname as the Battle of Armageddon. It's not actually the Battle of Armageddon. The plain of Megiddo is where the armies gather for a massive assault on Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the prize, and we read about the rock smashing the statue at its feet. Italy kicks Sicily into the sea, or so they say. Now, this graphic draws attention to the fact that in the push for European Union, back in the 1950s, there was a very crucial meeting which took place on the island of Sicily at a place called Messina. This crucially important meeting occurred in 1955 and led directly to the Treaty of Rome. That's right, the Treaty of Rome. That is what the future European Union was based on. And that meeting directly led to the creation of the European Economic Community, which was the precursor of the European Union. We read that a stone cut by no human hand smashes the statue at the feet. And what do we find with the Italian peninsula? The rock pointing to the toes of the boot of Italy, right where they held the meeting at Messina. So now if we go right back to the image of the Italian peninsula in the Mediterranean, the location of the Roman Empire, which is a graphic representation of the exact wording of the prophecy in Daniel 2:34, a geographical feature on the surface of the earth that I call the handprint of God, which proves the truth of the whole Bible message. This prophecy in Daniel is a centrally important prophecy in the Bible. It gives you the whole progression of history leading up to the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. It represents the whole Bible message that could only have been put there by the Judeo-Christian God himself, the author of that message to the human race. Now, this take on the prophecy in Daniel, what I call the Daniel 2:34 revelation, is actually considerably more significant than even the discovery of Noah's Ark would be. I mean, after all, even if we discovered Noah's Ark, it wouldn't prove there is a God, for example. It would prove the story of the flood and be hugely compelling evidence for the existence of the God of the Bible. But the Daniel 2:34 revelation is a permanent feature of the Earth's geography, which depicts the plan of God as a physical object that's always been there and always will be there. And it's not proof of God through classical arguments of ontological reasoning or arguments from first causes or elaborate Bible codes. This is an object, something with GPS coordinates attached to it. A plain, simple, physical demonstration of God's presence in the world. We live in a world where people experience emptiness, hopelessness, and lack of any purpose in their lives, leading many to depression and even suicide. This is a message of hope for the hopeless and for the wider world, especially the English-speaking people. This is our future. And when this happens, there are a lot of people who will want answers for all that is taking place. And this is the kind of proof of God's existence that we need to be able to present to people in these dark times. So with that, I close this presentation. I hope that it's something that might strengthen people's faith and maybe convince those who are not believers in the Bible message that God has a plan for them and for the world. Thank you.